Welcome to E3, Engage and Empower with Empathy, a podcast brought to you by the Empathy Collective, a consulting firm that helps business leaders inspire change, one conversation at a time. We are building a community of like-minded leaders and experts who all share the same passion, taking care of people at work. Whether you are a blue-collar worker or white-collar worker, small business owner or corporate executive, you belong in this community. From the White House's battle with Ivy League schools and DEI removal mandates from K through 12 schools, it feels like there is a war on empathy in education. My guest today, Kristin Hokanson, is an experienced educator who has spent her career driving innovation in K through 12 education. In today's episode, we are going to cut through the noise coming from the White House Department of Education and talk about the evolving role of empathy in the learning environment. Is empathy dying a slow death in our schools? Absolutely not. We will also talk about the importance of media literacy in interpreting news headlines. There is a lot of good work happening in education, despite what we are seeing in the news. Let's highlight the good work being done and elevate the educators who continue to bring empathy to their students as a tool that will build a better society. This is E3. Engage and empower with empathy. Welcome to the show, Kristin. It is so lovely to have you here. You have an incredibly unique skill set. I mean, given your experience in education and also media literacy, I'm really excited to have this conversation because I think it's so relevant for the present day. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, I just cannot help but start this conversation with the political war on academia that's happening right now. And this is not a political podcast. I don't try to politicize conversations on this podcast. But I think given your experience in innovation and education, I know you'll have an interesting viewpoint on this and how we can really break through some of the noise that we're seeing in the news headlines right now. And clearly there seems to be a war on education in the White House, and there have been some direct attacks on the Ivy Leagues in particular with frozen research grants. And then in K-12 schools, we're looking at withdrawing federal funding from schools with DEI programs. So there's all this noise happening. So without turning this into a political conversation, how can we, through all this disruption and change and noise, kind of cut through to what is happening in the educational sphere, college campuses, K-12 schools, doesn't matter, just education in general, because I know empathy isn't dying a slow death in education. I think it's ever more critical. In your experience driving innovation in the education environment, how have you seen that assist both students and faculty lead through change and disruption like what we're experiencing right now?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that education is a human industry, right? And so we have to focus on the human impact of all of the things that you mentioned, right? We're talking about, I say whiplash around what it means to have a free and fair public education. I think there's a lot of conflicting dialogue around what that actually means, and it leaves districts and teachers and leaders unsure about what's legal, what's ethical, what's enforceable in education. And I think the more that we can focus on this idea around the human impact of all of these things, with everything pressing down on school, it's no wonder that schools are overwhelmed, to say the least. And but the importance of education still sits, right? We're responsible for ensuring that we have an educated population in the end. And it's why I think this idea of empathy, and we're going to talk a little bit later on about curiosity and communication, being clear, are so critically important. I think empathy builds trust. I think the more that you can, in a space where people are fearful, uncertain, angry maybe, they need to feel heard. And I think that that's one important reason why empathy and dialogue are critical in times of disruption. The more that you can stay connected, the less you can seem polarized. And I think the polarization right now and the rhetoric around the language being used across the board around education helps, I think, keep folks around ideological lines and respectful dialogue, even when they disagree. You can't have a learning community unless you're willing to listen to other sides of dialogue. And I think that's really difficult. Some of the ways, and I think your original question was around what is the role of empathy in guiding through change and disruption. I said it builds trust, it prevents polarization, it drives resilience. And I think that that's what education always has been, right? It's every year, a new acronym, a new program, a new something to learn. Teachers and instructional leaders are lifelong learners. We've kind of been on that hamster wheel for a long time. But I think that resilience comes when faculty and families and students are able to stay engaged when they feel that they're being heard. When you make assumptions, that's where the distrust comes, as opposed to when you listen and try to understand where someone is coming from. That's where this idea of resilience and transparency comes in.
I think that's an interesting point, and it actually brings a question in my mind, because I'm actually working with leaders to coach them on how to listen better, so that they can have conversations around change with their employees. And the question that I ask myself is, because I was thinking back to my K-12 education or even my college education, no one actually taught me how to listen or how to engage with someone in an emotionally intelligent way. So it's all, at least in business schools, we're taught how to develop a business strategy and execute on it. And business leaders are also measured from a performance perspective on that execution piece. But no one is measured on how well they engage with their employees and having empathic conversations, for example, to build that resilience. Is it being taught, at the K through 12 level? Is that something that our young children are being exposed to? Or is it something that we should think about introducing into the younger student population?
Yeah, and I think that's where some of the polarity is coming in today, right? Because you hear attacks on DEI, and that's why I said another year, another acronym, right? To me, the opposite of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and again, you have to sound it out, is like a commonality, a consistency, and we all know that the same thing doesn't work for everyone, right? Um, and this idea of exclusion, the opposite of that is exclusion. And do you want people's ideas to be excluded in any environment when you're trying to when you're trying to execute change? If you're leaving out some of the ideas and voices and you're not hearing the concerns that they may have in a way that you can reflect on as a leader, right? It's going to be really difficult to get to where you need to be in the long run, right? Because, and I've seen all kinds of scenarios in education, we call them the resistors of change. And we spend a lot of time pushing back on the resistors without an understanding of the why behind it. What are their concerns? What do they see? Again, what do they notice about what's happening in the organization? That you might be missing because as a leader, you're so immersed in the change that you're trying to achieve that you don't often see it through different lenses. And I think that opportunity to use active listening, to hear from other voices, and to reflect on it are things that are really important. It may be a slower change, but it's probably going to be a more effective change in the long run, right? Because you're going to have buy-in from places that you may not have gotten buy-in in the past because you didn't take the opportunity to seek the other ideas that you may have missed.
So basically what you're saying is, although the change might take a little bit more time to implement because you are spending time with your resistors, engaging, listening, noticing and wondering, and we'll talk about that next, this in the long run is more, it creates more sustainable change. So in the end, you're not having to backtrack on your efforts because you're trying to just plow right through it and move past your resistors just to get into the execution mode. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
I actually interviewed someone several episodes ago who is specialized in connectedness and relationship building. She's a psychotherapist, and she mentioned the link between curiosity and empathy, and you made that link too. So the
Mm-hmm.
fact that I've talked to two experts in two very different domains who have brought this up without me probing for it, I find it interesting. So what is this whole notice and wonder concept, and how have you seen it come to life in the world of education?
So for me, it started as a teaching strategy, but it really is a lot more than that. It's more a survival skill, right, for healthy communities. It invites this idea of observation without judgment, right? So when you're listing what you notice about something or what you see in a particular situation, you're doing that in a way that it's what is there. When I started with this in education, I would ask kids because it was always helpful to see with children what where they were coming from when they were learning a new concept, right? And it's the same in society too, right? We have opposite sides of a stick here, and obviously both sides are seeing something that another side doesn't see. The importance of offering a free and public education to everyone is on one side, and this idea that I'm a parent and I should be able to choose the ideas and concepts that my kids have on another side without listening to both sides and hearing what are the things that they're noticing in the current system, and then what are the things that they're wondering about. When I used this in the classroom, I was shifting it from a mindset of kids thinking that the answer that they had was a right or wrong answer, and more to let's explore these ideas a little bit deeper, and use what you currently know. Back when I was a pre-service teacher, we used a KWL. What do I know? What do I want to know? And what have I learned? And what I noticed, it's less about what do you want to know and more about what do you think about what you notice that causes you to have these wonderings, these questions. That idea of we're observing first without judgment leads us to a place where we can be curious without fear. And it shifts that idea, I said, from right or wrong to one of exploration. And it creates a sort of psychological safety, right? That you're safe to share ideas, to make mistakes, and to grow from them, right? And it's very different from your traditional education where this is the information that I have to give you, and I'm going to give the information to you in a way that hopefully you will understand. And at the end, you'll be able to give that information back to me. And I was not that kind of learner in school. I was a curious learner. I wanted to learn more without this right or wrong, yes or no, true, false, choose the right out of two answers. In that way, it's reflective of empathy because it forces us to look at what might the other person or the learner or the person being faced with this change, right? What might they be feeling? It looks at the why. Why might they be feeling this way? And then also, what am I missing about the perspective that they're bringing in? It really moves that idea of away from performative or shallow, oh, we're going to take a survey and get your ideas. But it encourages this idea of a deeper, more ongoing understanding. It matters so much because it's easy to clickbait and look at a piece of information without saying, this doesn't sound right, or to have such strong feelings about something that you become triggered into more divisiveness. It slows down that process, that rush to judgment, and seeks to understand first before judging. And it builds, again, more inclusive, more reflective learning communities that can work through these differences without falling apart. I think that's kind of a connection that has stood out to me for years. And then it builds ownership in the process.
It's so interesting that you mentioned clickbait. I worry that we are losing this ability to notice and wonder. It's wonderful that educators like you have infused this into the way that you teach children. But meanwhile, we're surrounded by social media,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know if people really take the time to notice and wonder when they're engaging with content on social media because everything is clickbait, right?
Right. Well,
So
and I think that media is trying to control a narrative. I don't even want to say control, but they're trying to share a narrative. We want it to be less about the control and more about the connection. And I think that that's a space that empathy really works together with curiosity. What is learning if it's finding more out about what you're curious? I mean, that's what adult learning is, right? And those are the learnings that we do as adults. And so how do you, as you said, at the very earliest ages, get our students engaged in a space where they become curious about the world around them? Somewhere there's a shift that happens. I hear a lot of folks in my space that talk about the difference between learning and schooling. And I think that that's a really important distinction to make, right? Are we there for the teaching part of it, for the schooling part of it? Or is the important part of it the learning? And I think that that carries into the adult world as well. No matter what job you have, you're most likely always going to be learning as the world around you changes rapidly, with the types of technologies that we have available. That's a huge concern in school today, is this idea of artificial intelligence and who is monitoring, who is ensuring safety behind some of these more modern tools. Are we thinking about the end user in the process, or are we just trying to get to a space of efficiency without curiosity? And that's concerning, right? Because that curiosity is what's going to drive us into our adult lives as learners.
I don't want to sound all doom and gloom, because I'm always a glass half full kind of person. But
Mm-hmm.
as we're having this conversation, all I can think about is the evolution between, and like you said, the shift happens at some point. You're a young person, like my 5-year-old right now, he's in that phase where everything is why. And so
Mm-hmm.
curiosity is at its peak right now.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't think twice about asking really random questions, and oftentimes really fascinating ones that make me think like, oh, I don't know if I know the answer to that. I'll probably have to look it up. But at some point that goes away, or those
Mm-hmm.
why questions go away. And then we become adults, and then we have our structured way of doing things, and we become more ingrained in our ways. Are we losing a sense of curiosity?
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned AI. Is that going to impact our ability to be curious? I mean, I can't help but think, how is this going to impact curiosity, especially as we evolve from childhood to adulthood, where we already are losing that sense of curiosity, it seems to me.
Yeah. It goes back to controlling the narrative. And are we using artificial intelligence as a way to maintain your curiosity, right? Are you learning how to write effective prompts in ways that are going to expand the types of questions that you ask? And again, I have tons of strategies in education where you can just sit and the question formulation technique is one of them, acronym QFT, right? Where you just sit down and you come up with a topic and you think of what are all of the questions that you can ask about this topic. And some of them are absolutely bizarre, right? When kids perform this activity, as you have seen with your 5-year-old. But there comes a point where then you kind of rank the questions and you say, which of these is going to give me the most information to help me to get to the topic? And then how am I going to go about finding that information, right? Because that's the important thing that should be happening in schools today. But again, that requires a level of critical thinking that does make some folks uncomfortable. That critical thinking comes when you get to see the ideas and perspectives through a different lens, when you get to experience people in a way that not only looks at your own ideas and perspectives, but thinks about, well, what ideas and perspectives might I be missing? And I think it's what drew me to media literacy in the first place, right? Because even in an elementary classroom, children are exposed to media in all sorts of formats, not just in school, but out of school. And to be honest, the ideas that they bring you are going to come from all of the experiences that they have, and they're going to be rattling around in their little heads. And sometimes you don't know where the ideas come from. I was in a classroom. The teacher was doing a standard today, tomorrow, and yesterday lesson with a calendar in a kindergarten class. And we had talked about kind of branching out and giving kids an opportunity to have some voice in the classroom and a little less rote questioning and more the idea of, and so the teacher had done some of that. And the student, today is Monday, tomorrow is Tuesday. What was yesterday? And a little boy raised his hand or shouted out, macaroni. And the teacher said, ordinarily I would have gotten upset at this child, thinking that perhaps he was coming to this because, again, not a lot of student voice. And she said, well, that's interesting. I don't know a day of the week that's called macaroni. What is it about yesterday that made you think macaroni? Well, it so happened that his family gets together on Sundays. They're an Italian family and they eat macaroni on Sundays. And so to him, making that connection between Sunday and macaroni was what the teacher needed to say, do you do that every week? Do you know that the day of the week that you do that on is Sundays? And Sunday was yesterday, right? So again, bringing it back to an idea, now that child might have something that's going to tie the concept of Sunday to something that the student knows, understands, and can internalize. And the teacher taking time to take a kid who would honestly be off the rails here or answering in silly ways to think about why it is that that child may be coming to that idea or concept from a different place than everybody else may have. And again, it sometimes takes you longer to get to where you need to be, but when you get there, you're going to get there and it's going to be gotten. And I think that's in education anyway. The important piece is we want to get kids to the space where they get it and that they're curious beyond it.
I think that's an excellent point. What you were saying about taking the time to understand what connected macaroni to the day of the week. The more efficient way would be to just keep plowing forward, right? And say, well, that's a
Correct.
silly response. Don't throw out random responses like that. And I worry that as adults, that's all we do is we just
Mm-hmm.
plow ahead. Like we don't take the time to think about, well, that point of view is just ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm just going to move forward with my own point
Mm-hmm.
of view. So tell me a little bit more about this media literacy piece, because you referenced it a few minutes ago. What is media literacy and how can we use it as a way to maybe pause and think about macaroni a little bit as adults too, not just children, and maybe interpret things in different ways before just plowing forward?
It's funny because I consider myself an educator. I always introduce myself as a recovering elementary teacher, even though I've held positions teaching at a high school level, an instructional coach, consulting. I've been a school administrator, but I was introduced to media literacy when I was working as an instructional coach at the high school level and thinking about some of the things that I did with students in the classroom, right? So my kids in the third grade, we had a wax museum where when we were studying biographies, I was teaching the skills of reading informational text, taking notes, outlining, using one piece of literature. So we would learn about Ben Franklin, and the students would go on and reflect those same things on their own. And their final project was they needed to create a video or advertisement as the character, right? So as George Washington or as I'm trying to think of some non-historical because I would let the kids do whomever they wanted to, but that idea of they had to do research, right? They had to access information. They had to know how to analyze that information and evaluate whether their sources were relevant. And then they needed to create something through the process. And what I learned is that those are really the key skills in media literacy, right? Is the ability to access information, to analyze the information that you find wherever you find it, evaluate the source of that information, create something new, and then often act. Right, because that's the space we're in now is the space of activism, and doing that using all forms of communication, from traditional news, or when I was in college, we went to the library and we scrolled things in microfiche, and there were some of these pieces that didn't need to happen when you were doing a traditional educational process, but we were still surrounded by other forms of media on the daily basis, right? We were still surrounded by news. It's just that today it's coming at us in so many different formats, right? It's not just sitting down at 6 o'clock to watch the 6 p.m. news, but it's what are the forms of media that you're being exposed to, the news media, the video sources, the music that kids are. In school, we talk about analyzing your sources, and I gave them the South Pacific tree octopus, which was an article that looked very relevant online, but I would teach my kids to look at, who is the author, who is the intended audience. But it wasn't just about spotting whether or not a source was true, but also understanding the how and why media is created, and the power that media has to shape opinions, emotions, and behaviors. And again, I think about my own children who are 25, 22, and 18 going into college, and I look at the amount of information, the messages that they're bombarded with on the daily, whether it's Instagram or TikTok, whether they're on YouTube TV or getting a commercial, right? When you are media literate, it empowers you to recognize not only those trustworthy sources, but to recognize bias, to understand multiple perspectives. It goes back to that idea of empathy, right? It strengthens civic engagement, critical thinking, resilience against misinformation. And I think right now, the concern is the misinformation that's coming across in the media in many ways. I'm going to go back to that word clickbait, right? When you see something that triggers you, the first thing you want to do is share it, right? The first thing you want to do is give your commentary on how you feel about that without stopping to say, is this a real source? Did it come from satire? What am I missing about the other side? We're stopping at the access, right? That there's lots of information there for us to get. What are we doing with it? And I think that requires a huge amount of understanding. And it goes back to that idea of empathy, right? And multiple perspectives. How are we looking at all of the perspectives that are out there and understanding from what lens is this coming? And then is it okay or not? Because there is some misinformation that is harmful. And I'm going to go back to that human connection and looking at situations through that. And especially for me in education, right? It's that human lens. It's understanding that every child sitting in front of me is coming with their ideas and perspectives and their humanness. And their family may believe something very different from the family of the student that's sitting beside them, but that they're both valued and that we need to learn to understand those unique perspectives. And again, in a place where people being different and understanding differences and taking time to question those differences are under attack, that's hugely concerning because it takes away learning opportunities across the board. How do you provide opportunities for students to experience empathy? There have actually been educational groups that have attacked schools for being too empathetic. There's some real research around how certain students view math, right? And if you're not good at math and all we do is make you do more math without understanding the why behind why you don't like math or why you feel like you're not good at math, you're going to continue to not be good at math, right? And so asking kids to stop and reflect, that idea of reflection, right? We haven't talked about reflection a lot, but we talk about listening to other perspectives is only one piece of the puzzle. It's reflecting on that perspective or even reflecting on your own ideas. That's important, but that's scary too, right? Because it might force you to come up with an idea that's different, and especially for children, that's different from maybe what you're being taught outside of school. And so it really is a challenging balancing act that needs to happen in order to continue. And like you said, I like to think that I'm the glass half full kind of person too. But when there's threats happening and things of, especially funding, it's really hard to look at a school for a female when we're losing funds for women to do research or women in STEM and making a choice that's going to allow you over the next 4 years to have the best opportunity that you can have in any given circumstance. When these attacks are happening, it's a challenge. And so I just continue to go back to, we need to reflect on the why that is, and we need to think about what can we do to help push that change forward, by not reacting and by listening, active listening, to try to get to a space where folks feel like they're being heard.
Yeah, and you mentioned activism too, and I think that's the probably the best thing that we all can do right now. I keep telling myself actually, because I've just launched a change readiness consulting business where empathy is at the core. And so I'm approaching organizations who seem to be basically ignoring empathy and plowing forward. I could be looking at this and saying, this is probably the worst time to be launching an empathy consulting business. Or
Or the
I could
best.
flip it around, right? And say, you
Yeah.
know what? Let's capitalize on the people who see past the noise and
hmm
know that to have sustainable growth and value, that and engaging in the human side of running a business is absolutely critical for long-term business success. And we could say the same thing about education.
hmm
For those educators who know that see the value, know the value, are pushing it in schools and continue to embrace it, they're the ones who are going to step up and be activists and have a voice. What would you say is like maybe the top 3 recommendations you would maybe give to educators, leaders, anyone listening to this episode who's feeling a little down about the situation in the world right now, thinking maybe empathy is going down the drain? I don't think it is. I think now is the time to embrace it. What would you say?
And I hope I haven't come off as being a negative Nancy, because I think that this is what educators have done for a long time. Kids don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think that that's an important message across the board that carries, again, into adulthood. One of the things that I didn't talk about when we talked about notice and wonder is, if we're noticing and we're looking at things from a particular perspective and we're saying, I just wonder about that particular scenario, going back to the person who came to you with the issue in the first place, and including them in the process, right? That what if, or how might we, or what do you see as a path moving forward? Again, if we can embed some of that in any discussions that we're having, what do you notice? What do you wonder? What do you see? What do you think about it? And then where do we go from here? What do you see as an effective path forward? You're thinking here, I'm thinking here. How might we forge this? I think we need to flood the zone with empathy-based content, right? I think we need to celebrate and amplify media that promotes understanding, that promotes collaboration, that promotes the idea of having diverse voices, and model this idea of consuming and sharing thoughtful, humanizing content, right? It's the opposite of the clickbait. It's not the negative things that are happening, but the positive things that we want to see. And that's what we need to continue to flood the zone with. A friend of mine wrote a book, and in one of the chapters, it was about what schools can be, School 2.0. And I was quoted as saying, we have to stop admiring the problems, right? I think oftentimes, and when you say you're launching a consultancy business that centers around empathy, right? People are going to come to you and say, um, I'm not getting the results that I want. I'm forging forward. I've got these great ideas and they're not getting me anywhere. Notice, right? Wonder, and then lead with the, well, how might we? That's going to get them beyond admiring that problem and into the action, right? It goes back to that idea of media literacy. We often think about being the access, analyze, evaluate, create, and we forget the act. What do we do from here? How is this going to get us to the place we want to be? And I think we need to think about encouraging slow thinking versus fast reactions. Kids have been in schools that focus on media literacy. It's that idea of stop and think, you know, whose message is this? Is it reflective of the views, but more so, whose ideas are missing from this? And how might we learn from that? Those are a few things that can keep us out of that doom and gloom and admiring the problems, right? Because we cannot eliminate these anti-empathy messages entirely, right? We're seeing them on the daily basis, but we can strengthen our ability to practice these media literacy strategies and also practice intentional empathy, right? So we can make those messages easier to spot and harder to spread. If we can get folks to notice the message, wonder about the motive, and then choose their response or reaction wisely, we're going to definitely get to the other side of where we are today with this polarization. But it's going to be a lot of hard work, and people have to stop and be thoughtful themselves before they can expect folks to be empathetic and thoughtful as well, right? We can't continue to post clickbait and name call and expect to be all right on the other side. So ask folks, what are you noticing about this? And where do we go from here?
That's such wonderful advice. And when you were saying look for what's missing, I mean, that's
Mhm.
something that I don't even think about doing. So I feel like that's my personal takeaway from this conversation. Look for what potentially is missing from the dialogue or the perspective before just, entirely interpreting it as is, without thinking about it further. And I think what you're saying about just being more intentional and thoughtful, all of us can do more of that because
Yeah.
we're all moving at the speed of light right now, just reacting, reacting, reacting.
And again, I think it comes down to that slowing down, right? And when you asked about a definition of media literacy, there are some great tools out there. I'm affiliated with the Media Education Lab. We have a tool that's used often in schools. It's a smartphone, and it has some key questions that you can ask on one side. So, who is the author of this message and what is the purpose? What techniques is the author using to attract or hold your attention? Because
Mm.
oftentimes it's the techniques that keep you watching, that Instagram share that you only get the first 10 seconds to make you click on it to see more. We want to look at what lifestyles, values, points of views are represented. How might this message be interpreted differently by different people? And then also what's omitted. And that what's omitted is the piece that you said too, not many people think about. Because again, something is being left out for a reason. And when we can get to what that reason is, then we can start to move forward in some positive ways.
Absolutely. What a wonderful takeaway from this conversation. I feel like we all have some concrete actions that we can start practicing and moving
Hmm.
forward with as we engage with content and we think about creating our own content as well. Thank you for this really fascinating conversation, and thank you for giving me a really educational experience this morning. Thank you so much, Kristen. This was a really fun dialogue.
Well, I appreciate you giving me the time. It's really important. We'll get there.
We will. It's important to stay positive. I think to your point, continue to notice and wonder, stay strong, stay positive, leverage activism, and let's embrace empathy as much as we can in education and beyond, because we know on the long run it will make a positive impact on people's lives. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And if you would like to learn more about the Empathy Collective, check out our website, theempathycollective.com. Life is too short. Let's take care of each other at work so that together we can make this world a better place.